Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It feels sort of like engineering.
Right, yeah, like fixing a machine.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the
Yeah.
doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. That's the problem.
Is deeply comforting to have that binary clarity. I mean, broken or not broken, we naturally gravitate toward things that can be made visible
Mm.
and just neatly categorized.
But the moment you step into the world of memory, of neurodevelopment and human consciousness, that whole metaphorical X-ray machine just completely
Right,
shatters.
absolutely. It falls apart.
We are no longer looking at a clean fracture. We are staring into a dense, murky, and wildly complicated landscape, and today we are taking on a pretty staggering mission.
We really are.
We are dissecting memory. We're
Right.
going to look at the hard biological anatomy, zoom all the way down into the quantum physics of how a thought might physically manifest, and then, rocket completely out of the physical realm into esoteric spiritual philosophy.
It is quite the journey.
It is, and we are so glad you are here with us, sitting right in that third chair for this deep dive.
Yeah, welcome. And looking at the massive stack of sources you have provided for us today, the sheer breadth is honestly incredibly daunting.
It's a lot to get through.
It is. We're pulling from clinical textbooks on dementia, Eric Kendall's Nobel Prize-winning biological research on sea snails, the heavily debated quantum consciousness theories of Roger Penrose, all the way to esoteric texts exploring ancient memory palaces and the Akasha Chronicle.
It is the ultimate intellectual whiplash, honestly.
Yeah. To reflect the scale of what we're trying to weave together, let's change our visual backdrop for today. Imagine a mesmerizing blend of a glowing, heavily active neural network slowly overlapping with ancient star charts and the, endless dust-filled shelves of an esoteric library.
I love that visual. That's perfect.
But before we go any further, a brief but really critical note on the nature of these sources.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yes, the quantum theories of consciousness and the esoteric spiritual narratives of Rudolf Steiner contain highly controversial scientific propositions and deeply non-traditional views of reality.
Very non-traditional.
Exactly. So our goal here is not to take a side or to validate or to debunk any of these claims. We are going to impartially unpack these fascinating ideas exactly as they are presented in the material you shared with us.
We are just the guides on this very wild expedition. So let's ground ourselves first in the clinical reality of the brain.
Good place to start.
According to the medical texts provided, memory is generally broken down into three fundamental stages. The three R's: registration, retention, and retrieval. How do these actually function in practice?
Well, registration, which is often called encoding, is the very first step. It is the initial learning of information.
Like just taking things in.
Right. You are perceiving the world, taking in visual data, acoustic data, semantic meaning, and your brain is making a split-second decision about whether this data is actually worth keeping.
Okay, so that's registration.
Yeah. Then retention, or storage, is the process of maintaining that information over time. And retrieval is the ability to access that stored information exactly when you need it.
So when I forget something, what's actually happening there?
When you experience what we call forgetting, you haven't necessarily lost the memory. You have experienced a functional failure at one of these three distinct checkpoints.
Oh, I see.
You either didn't encode it properly in the first place, you didn't store it securely, or the pathway to retrieve it is just blocked.
Okay, the clinical texts use an incredibly helpful analogy to map this onto the physical geography of the brain.
The office building one, right?
Yes. Think of your brain anatomy like a massive, highly structured office building. The frontal lobes of your brain, sitting right behind your forehead, act as the file clerk. They organize, sort, and direct the flow of all the paperwork coming in. Then the medial temporal lobes, which we can just call the MTL, include deeper structures like the hippocampus, the entorhinal, parielinal, and perihippocampal cortices.
That's a mouthful.
It really is. But this whole MTL region is essentially your recent memory file cabinet.
Right. The short-term storage.
Exactly. And finally, the vast neocortex, that deeply wrinkled outer layer spreading across the top of your brain, is the remote memory file cabinet. It is the deep storage warehouse.
And that system is remarkably efficient, but its delicate nature becomes obvious when the file clerk or the cabinets sustain damage.
Which brings us to patient HM, right?
Yes, a foundational moment in modern neuroscience. In the early 1950s, this man was suffering from debilitating, life-threatening seizures.
Just awful.
In a desperate attempt to cure him, surgeons performed an experimental procedure where they bilaterally removed his medial temporal lobes.
So in the context of our analogy, they permanently surgically removed his recent memory file cabinet.
Exactly. And the outcome of that surgery completely rewrote our understanding of the brain.
Did it cure the seizures?
The seizures were drastically reduced, yeah. Furthermore, HM's general intelligence, his vocabulary, his personality, and his childhood memories, all of that remained completely intact.
Wow. But there was a catch.
A huge one. He lost the ability to form any new declarative memories for the rest of his life.
That is just wild.
He could meet a researcher, have a fascinating 10-minute conversation. The researcher would leave the room, come back 2 minutes later, and HM would have absolutely no recollection of ever meeting them.
Every time he ate a meal, it was as if it was the first time.
Right. Which proved that memory isn't just some vague, generalized cloud of energy floating around the whole brain.
It's physical hardware.
Yes, it is a distinct cerebral function with specific, localized physical hardware. It perfectly illustrated a concept known as Ribot's law.
Ribot's law, right. Remind me how that works.
It states that recently acquired memories are far more vulnerable to loss than older, deeply consolidated memories.
Because they haven't been filed away yet.
Exactly. Because HM's older childhood memories had already been processed through the medial temporal lobe years ago and transferred up into the deep storage warehouse of the neocortex, they were completely safe from the surgeon's scalpel.
Oh, wow. So only the intake system for new memories was destroyed.
Precisely.
But how does a moment, like a fleeting experience, like drinking a cup of coffee or hearing a dog bark, actually get from the outside world into that filing cabinet? I mean, how do we transition from just perceiving something in real time to actually turning it into a memory?
The sources describe a deeply complex mechanism called the dual stream model.
Okay.
When you experience an event, your brain doesn't just swallow the scene whole. It splits the sensory data into two distinct pathways.
Like breaking it into parts.
Exactly. One stream is dedicated entirely to processing what you are experiencing, the specific objects, the faces, the colors. This data flows through the parietal cortex.
And the second stream?
The second stream processes where this is all happening, the spatial context, the layout of the room, the environment, and this data flows through the perihippocampal cortex.
So you have a what stream and a where stream.
Right. Both of these separate streams then converge in a structure called the entorhinal cortex. Think of the entorhinal cortex as a major gateway or funnel.
Taking the what and the where and mashing them together.
Pushing all of this combined data directly into the hippocampus, yes.
And the hippocampus is where those disparate pieces of data actually get stitched together.
Specifically, this happens within a microscopic subregion of the hippocampus called CA3.
CA3.
The neurons in CA3 possess a unique structural feature. They have highly developed associative recurrent collateral connections.
Wait, recurrent collateral connections. Let's break that down because that sounds intense.
It does. Imagine a standard neuron sending a signal out to its neighbor in a straight line. The CA3 neurons do that, but they also have branches that loop back around to connect with themselves and with a massive web of their immediate neighbors.
So they are literally creating loops.
Exactly. Because these neurons loop back, firing the what neuron automatically triggers the where neuron it is attached to. They wire together in a continuous feedback loop.
Oh, that makes sense.
This looping mechanism is how the brain binds the smell of a specific perfume and the visual layout of a specific restaurant into a single, cohesive, episodic memory.
Right. So later on, just smelling the perfume is enough to trigger the entire loop and light up the memory of the restaurant.
You've got it.
I want to focus on something crucial from the clinical sources here. Because we are talking about filing cabinets and data streams, it is really easy to assume our memories are like video files saved on a hard drive.
A very common misconception.
But the texts are extremely clear that memory is absolutely nothing like a video recording.
And not even close. They are heavily reconstructed living constructs.
Living constructs.
The text referenced the foundational work of psychologist Sir Frederick Bartlett and his concept of schemas.
Schemas. These are basically mental frameworks. Right?
Exactly. They are essentially pre-existing templates built from our past experiences, our cultural prejudices, and our personal values.
So they shape how we remember things.
Heavily. When you recall a memory, you are not hitting play on a preserved engram. Your brain is pulling up the bare-bones structural data from the neocortex and reconstructing the event on the fly.
And filling in all the missing gaps using those schemas. Let's use an analogy to clarify this. Think of your memory like a forensic sketch artist.
Okay, I like this.
The brain does not have a high-definition photograph of the suspect. It only has a few basic, fragmented details saved in the files, maybe eye color, a rough face shape, a distinctive scar.
The raw data.
Right. To create the final picture you experience in your mind, the sketch artist has to draw the rest of the face based on generic templates of what human faces generally look like. Those templates are your schemas.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
And if the sketch artist holds a specific prejudice or assumes certain features always go together, those biases are drawn right into the memory.
And that reconstructive process is exactly why eyewitness testimony can be so deeply unreliable.
It's scary to think about.
It is. Every time we access a memory, we pull it out of storage, reconstruct it, and then we put it back. We save the new reconstructed version, biases and all.
Wow, so the memory changes every time you remember it.
Yes. But without schemas, we couldn't function at all. The sources mention certain cases of savant syndrome, where individuals have near-perfect direct recall of raw data, like they can memorize a phone book in an hour.
Right.
But they struggle profoundly to find generalized meaning or patterns in that data. They have the raw data, but lack the schemas to organize it into anything useful.
Okay, so we know where this happens in the hippocampus, and we know how the brain organizes the data using schemas. But if we zoom in with an electron microscope, what is physically changing inside the brain to store that data?
Now we are getting into the really granular stuff.
That brings us to Eric Kandel and his Nobel Prize-winning research in molecular biology. Out of all the complex animals on Earth, Kandel chose to study the Aplysia californica, the giant sea snail.
Yes, the unlikely hero of memory research.
Out of curiosity, why a sea snail? I mean, it feels like the least relatable creature to human memory.
It does seem totally counterintuitive. But Kandel chose the Aplysia for a very specific mechanical reason. They have enormous neurons.
Like how big?
The individual nerve cells are so large, you can literally see them with the naked eye.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, a sea snail only has about 20,000 neurons in its entire nervous system, compared to the estimated 100 billion in a human brain.
So the circuitry is incredibly simple.
Exactly. By studying the snail, scientists could isolate single connections and actually watch the physical process of memory happen in real time under a microscope.
That is incredible. And Kandel was focused on two basic forms of learning, right? Habituation and sensitization.
Correct.
Habituation is when an organism learns to ignore a completely harmless repetitive stimulus. In the lab, researchers would lightly tap the snail's gill. At first, the snail retracts the gill to protect itself.
Makes sense.
But if you keep tapping it and nothing bad happens, the snail eventually stops retracting it. It learns, this is boring, I can ignore this.
Right, it habituates.
And sensitization is the exact opposite. The researchers would give the snail a mild electrical shock and then tap the gill. The snail would violently retract it. It learns the environment is highly dangerous right now, be on maximum alert.
And the breakthrough came when Kandel's team looked at the physical synapses. Those are the gaps between the neurons where chemical signals are passed.
They wanted to see what changed after these learning events.
Yes, and they proved the biological difference between short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory alters the function of existing synapses.
So it doesn't change the structure, just how it works.
Exactly, it just tweaks the volume dial. If the snail is sensitized, the synapse temporarily releases more neurotransmitters to strengthen the signal.
Okay, but long-term memory?
Long-term memory requires actual physical anatomical changes.
Meaning the brain actually changes its shape.
To form a long-term memory, the neuron actually has to synthesize brand new proteins. It has to grow completely new synaptic terminals, expanding the physical connection between the cells.
And in the case of habituation?
In the case of habituation, where it learns to ignore something, it actively retracts and prunes away old synaptic terminals.
Wow.
And Kandel traced this entire logistical operation down to the genetic level. For a long-term memory to form, a specific transcription factor called CRE1 has to be activated deep inside the nucleus of the neuron.
CRE1.
Think of the nucleus as the headquarters. The CRB1 factor switches on specific genes that manufacture protein-building materials. Those materials are then shipped out of the nucleus, down the long arm of the cell to build new connections.
Here's where I need to stop and ask a logistical question.
Go ahead.
A single neuron in the human brain might be connected to thousands of other neurons.
Sure.
If the headquarters in the center of the cell is sending out a massive shipment of generic protein building blocks, how does the cell know which specific synapse out of thousands is supposed to grow?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because, like, if I'm trying to remember the French word for apple, I don't want my brain accidentally reinforcing the synapse that holds the memory of my third-grade gym teacher.
Right, that would be chaos.
Mm-hmm.
It is a stunning piece of biological logistics called synapse-specific facilitation.
Synapse-specific facilitation.
When a specific synapse is heavily stimulated, say, by the shock to the snail or by you intensely focusing on that French vocabulary word, a neurotransmitter called serotonin is released locally, right at that specific connection.
Oh, interesting.
This serotonin effectively marks or tags that one synapse. So when the massive shipment of CRB1 proteins leaves the nucleus and travels down the cell, it ignores all the thousands of unmarked synapses.
I see.
The proteins are only captured by the specific synapse that has been tagged as serotonin.
It is sort of like dropping a brightly lit chemical flare onto a landing zone for a cargo drop. The supply plane ignores the rest of the dark city and drops the supplies right on the flare.
Exactly. And this tagging process is heavily regulated by an enzyme called CAM-KII.
CAM-KII.
This enzyme acts as an indexing system, coordinating these flares and managing the protein capture.
The sources extrapolate this biological mechanism into something deeply provocative regarding a condition called hyperthymesia.
Oh yes, hyperthymesia.
This is an incredibly rare condition where a person possesses highly superior autobiographical memory. They remember virtually every single day of their life in perfect episodic detail.
Astounding.
Ask them what they did on a random Tuesday 12 years ago, and they can tell you the weather, what they ate for lunch, and what was on the evening news. The text suggests that in a typical brain, this CAM-KII indexing system is ruthlessly trimmed and pruned. We actively dismantle memories.
Forgetting is not a passive decay. It is an active, metabolically expensive, necessary biological process to prevent the system from overloading.
But in hyperthymesia, it's speculated that this specific trimming mechanism operates differently or is somehow inhibited. The protein flares never go out. The synapses never retract.
Which might sound like an incredible superpower, but individuals with this condition often describe it as profoundly overwhelming. Their mind is constantly flooded with the past.
Okay, so we have traced memory down to the CRE1 proteins, the CAM-KI enzymes, the physical growth of tiny protein bumps on a snail's synapse. Yeah. But here is my fundamental question, and it is the massive elephant in the room regarding Candle's research.
Let's hear it.
If a memory of your first kiss or the profound grief of losing a loved one is literally just a physical bump of protein sitting on a synapse, where does the feeling of the memory live? How do we make the miraculous, inexplicable jump from sea snail proteins to the subjective, conscious, emotional experience of reliving the past?
You have just articulated the hard problem of consciousness.
So a hard problem.
Yes. And it serves as the perfect bridge into the next massive paradigm in our sources. The quantum underground.
This is where things get really wild.
A growing number of physicists and neuroscientists argue that biology alone, the proteins, the synapses, the chemical flares, can never fully explain the subjective experience of memory.
Because it's just mechanics.
Right. They argue that looking at biology is like looking at the casing of a computer to understand the software. We have to look much deeper.
We are zooming past the brain lobe, past the cell, past the molecule, past the atom, all the way down into the quantum realm. Enter Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel laureate in physics, and Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist.
Together, they developed a highly controversial, intensely debated theory called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH, or R.
ORCH, or R.
Let's frame why this is so radical. The traditional neuroscientific view, the one we just discussed, assumes that consciousness and memory emerge from complex computation between neurons.
Millions of neurons firing together somehow create the illusion of subjective experience.
Exactly. Penrose and Hameroff completely flipped this paradigm. They argue that consciousness doesn't emerge from the connections between neurons. It originates at the quantum level inside the individual neurons themselves.
Inside the neurons, let's unpack the actual hardware they're talking about. Inside the physical scaffolding of your cells, including your neurons, are these tiny, rigid, tube-like structures called microtubules.
Yeah.
They essentially act as the skeleton of the cell, giving it its shape. Penrose and Hameroff argue that these microtubules are not just structural support beams, they are functioning quantum computers.
To understand how a structural tube becomes a quantum computer, we have to look at what's inside them. Inside these microtubules are oscillating dipoles.
Oscillating dipoles.
These are tiny electrical or magnetic charges. Because they operate at the microscopic quantum level, these dipoles can exist in a state of quantum superposition.
And in quantum mechanics, superposition means a particle can exist in multiple states or multiple physical orientations at the exact same time until it is observed or interacts with its environment.
Correct.
So we have these tiny oscillating charges sitting in multiple states at once inside the skeleton of our brain cells.
Yes. These dipoles form resonance rings that vibrate at incredibly high frequencies. We're talking about the megahertz and gigahertz ranges. In the context of computing, they act as qubits.
The basic fundamental unit of quantum information.
Exactly. According to a mechanism known as the Diosy-Penrose scheme, these superpositions grow and entangle with one another across the brain.
They connect?
They build up quantum tension until they reach a specific physical threshold. And this threshold is dictated by the fine structure of space-time geometry itself.
Wow.
Once they hit that exact threshold, the superposition becomes unstable and itself collapses into a single definitive state. This collapse is what they call objective reduction.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the magnitude of this. They are saying that the discrete collapse of the wave function, that specific mathematical moment when the quantum particles choose a definitive state that is a single moment of conscious awareness.
Yes, a flash of now.
A flash of now. And our smooth, continuous stream of conscious memory is just millions of these quantum collapses happening back to back in our microtubules.
That is the core proposition of Ochoa. It connects the biological processing of the brain directly to the fundamental quantum fabric of the universe.
It's mind-blowing.
And it dovetails beautifully with another deeply complex theory mentioned in your stack of sources, quantum brain dynamics. This was pioneered by neuroscientist Carl Pribram and the theoretical physicist David Bohm.
The holonomic brain theory. I found this to be one of the most conceptually difficult but beautiful ideas in the stack.
Pribram and Bohm suggested that the brain operates remarkably like a holographic storage network.
Holographic.
In standard neurobiology, we assume memories are stored in specific localized files, like the protein bumps Candle found. Pribram and Bohm argued that memories are actually encoded naturally in vast wave interference patterns within the fine-fibered dendritic webs of the brain.
Wait, what do you mean by wave interference patterns?
Think of dropping two pebbles into a calm pond at the same time. The ripples spread out and crash into each other, creating a complex pattern of peaks and troughs where the waves meet.
Okay, I can picture that.
That is an interference pattern. Pribram argued the brain's electrical activity creates similar patterns. The brain then analyzes these patterns, using something called Fourier transforms.
A Fourier transform. I've only ever heard that term in the context of audio engineering and music production.
It is the exact same mathematical principle. Imagine a massive, complex musical chord played on a piano. A Fourier transform is the mathematical formula that takes that single, complex sound wave and unbakes the cake, separating it back out into the individual simple notes, the C, the E, the G.
Right.
Carl Pribram proposed the brain uses this exact mathematical process to decode the complex wave interference patterns of sensory input, transforming them into the images and memories we perceive.
And the sources mention that the physical vehicles carrying these quantum wave states are things called Froelich condensates and Davidoff solitons.
Very heavy physics terms.
Let's try to translate that out of deep physics jargon. A Davidoff soliton is essentially a wave that travels through a medium without ever losing its shape or dissipating energy. Imagine a wave in the ocean that travels for 1,000 miles without ever breaking or getting smaller.
Perfect analogy.
These physicists are suggesting that biological structures in the brain are harboring these perfect, perpetual quantum waves.
But the sources push this concept even further into speculation. If memory fundamentally relies on quantum entanglement and the geometry of spacetime, what if space itself is the storage medium?
Oh, wow.
This introduces the concept of the memory field.
This proposes that the brain isn't a storage device at all. The brain is simply a tuning mechanism. I want to bring in an analogy from the sources here because it helped me conceptualize this entirely new paradigm.
Go for it.
Think of space-time as a vast cosmic vinyl record. The entire history of the universe is permanently pressed into the grooves of space-time. The microtubules in your brain, they act like the stylus, the sharp little needle on the record player. When you live your life and learn something new, your physical actions etch a specific groove into the quantum field.
Let's see where this is going.
When you try to remember something, The microtubule stylus in your brain is simply riding that exact same groove again, and the music of the past plays. The song isn't inside the needle. The memory isn't inside the biological meat of the brain. It is out there, in the grooves of space-time.
It is a stunning metaphor. But as analytical guides, we have to recognize that this invites immediate, massive pushback.
Of course.
The most obvious critique goes all the way back to the start of our deep dive. If memories are stored in the vinyl record of spacetime, why did removing a piece of patient HM's physical brain cause him to lose his memory?
Right. If my memory is floating out in the quantum geometry of the universe, why does taking out my biological hippocampus erase it? That seems completely contradictory.
The proponents of the memory field theory resolve this by focusing on the tuning process. They point out that the neural activity candle study the proteins, the recurrent collaterals, that biology choreographs the tuning of the stylus.
The dial on the radio.
Exactly. Your hippocampus is the physical dial on the radio. Breaking the physical radio in your kitchen doesn't destroy the radio waves broadcasting through the air from the station, but it absolutely stops you from hearing the music in your house.
The physical brain is the mandatory receiver required to access the quantum field.
It is a brilliant counterargument. Though, given our commitment to impartiality, we must emphasize that this entire quantum framework faces intense skepticism from the mainstream academic community.
Absolutely. The philosopher of mind, Patricia Churchland, famously and ruthlessly dismissed Penrose and Hameroff's theory. She stated that putting pixie dust in the synapses is about as explanatorily powerful as quantum coherence in the microtubules.
Pixie dust. That is hard.
Very hard.
The scientific argument behind her critique is that the physical environment of the human brain is warm, wet, and incredibly noisy.
Right. It's not a sterile lab.
Exactly. According to standard physics, quantum states are incredibly fragile. They require absolute zero temperatures and perfect isolation to maintain superposition. In the warm, wet brain, quantum states should decohere instantly, long before they could ever build up enough tension to collapse and create a moment of conscious memory.
So they just wouldn't survive.
That's the argument. Hameroff counters this by pointing to specific, dry, non-polar regions deep within the microtubules that could act as isolated shields for the quantum states. But the debate remains fierce and largely unresolved in the physics community.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next monumental shift in our sources. We are entering the philosophical divide. Materialism versus the science of the spirit.
Yes.
Because this exact debate, is the mind just mechanical biology, or is it something entirely different and has been raging for centuries?
To deeply understand this divide, we have to contextualize the 19th century. This was the absolute peak of scientific materialism.
Okay.
The staggering successes of chemistry, physics, and Darwin's evolutionary theory created a rigid academic paradigm where absolutely everything in existence had to be explained by physical matter.
Everything.
Everything. This worldview is captured perfectly by the German physiologist Carl Vogt. He famously, and rather bluntly, declared, "Thoughts stand in about the same relationship to the brain as gall to the liver."
Wow. Thought is just a biological secretion, like sweat or bile.
Precisely. A mechanical, inevitable byproduct of chemical reactions.
Yeah.
This paradigm was a direct, forceful rejection of historical philosophical views, most notably René Descartes' dualism from the 17th century.
Descartes.
Descartes argued that the human being is a composite of two entirely different, incompatible substances. There is the res externa, the physical matter of the body and brain, which operates entirely like a machine, bound by the laws of physics.
And the other substance.
And then there is the res cogitans, the non-physical thinking stuff of the soul. Descartes believed these two separate realms interacted with each other within the physical body through the pineal gland in the brain.
The materialists of the 19th century threw the res cogitans, the soul, entirely out the window. They said it's all just res externa, all meat and mechanics.
Exactly.
But the sources you provided introduce a completely different voice into this debate, a voice that attempts to transcend both Descartes and Kendall. The Austrian philosopher and esotericist Rudolf Steiner, and his vast philosophy known as anthroposophy, or the science of the spirit.
Steiner completely rejects the materialist view of Carl Vogt, but it is critical to note that he also doesn't approach this from the perspective of traditional dogmatic religion.
He comes at it differently.
He argues that the materialistic interpretation scientifically undermines itself. To prove this, he cites a prominent physiologist of his own era, Max Verworn. Verworn pointed out a fatal logical flaw in materialism. Even if we possessed technology advanced enough to look into the mechanical workings of the brain, like we were looking at the gears of a clock, watching every single physical atom vibrate and move, we would never, ever see a sensation, an idea, or a feeling.
Because it's just moving parts.
Right. The physical movement of atoms fundamentally cannot explain the subjective experience of the soul. The geometry of matter does not equate to the geometry of thought.
So Steiner's solution wasn't just to write philosophical treatises complaining about materialism. He claimed that to truly understand cognitive processes like memory, humanity must develop a new faculty he called spiritual perception.
Spiritual perception.
One has to actively train themselves to look at eternal, non-transitory history.
Steiner's proposing a radical practical methodology. He claimed that through rigorous, specific, esoteric training, the higher development of a human being literally begins to alter their physiology.
Altering their actual physical body.
Yes. He wrote that this training dissolves the ordinary, tight connections of the physical brain molecules. He says the brain molecules literally become loosened.
Loosened brain molecules.
This physical loosening fundamentally changes the way the brain functions as a receiver, allowing the individual to bypass intellectual speculation entirely and achieve a state of higher seeing or direct, unmediated spiritual intuition.
I need to pause us right here because if you are listening to this and you are trying to synthesize everything we've discussed, you might be experiencing profound intellectual whiplash.
Oh, without a doubt.
How on earth do we bridge Eric Kandel's meticulously proven CRE1 proteins and snail synapses with Rudolf Steiner's esoteric claims of loosened brain molecules and spiritual perception? We are reading two entirely different languages of reality.
We are reading two different languages, and it requires a shift in how we view the organism. Kandel is measuring the mechanical hardware of the physical receiver. He's describing the wiring.
And
Steiner is claiming he has found a methodology to upgrade the receiver's antenna so it can pick up a completely different, normally invisible spectrum of reality. He argues that our current logical, brain-bound, intellectually rigid consciousness is not the only way humans have interacted with the world.
Which launches us into the next deeply esoteric section of the sources, Steiner's evolutionary cognitive processes.
This is fascinating stuff.
And this is where Steiner's cosmology completely diverges from standard anthropology. He outlines a prehistory of mankind that involves deeply ancient, lost civilizations. Specifically, he talks about our ancestors who lived on the lost continent of Atlantis.
He focuses heavily on the first subrace of this Atlantean epoch, a people he refers to as the Ramahals.
The Ramahals.
According to the spiritual perceptions Steiner claimed to utilize, these early Atlanteans were fundamentally cognitively different from modern humans. They entirely lacked the capacity for logical reason.
No logic at all.
None. They couldn't deduce cause and effect. They couldn't plan for the future using logic. They couldn't combine arithmetically. But in exchange for this lack of logic, they possessed a highly developed, incredibly vivid, pure image-based memory.
They remembered pure, vivid sense impressions. And because their memory was so completely unedited by logic and so deeply tied to the raw forces of nature around them, Steiner claims their spoken language possessed actual physical power.
Yes, the esoteric texts call this the magic of the word.
The magic of the word.
When a Ramahal spoke, the word was not merely an abstract symbol. It was intimately connected to the life force or germinal energy of nature itself.
So it actually did something physically.
They didn't just invent a name for a plant. The specific sound they uttered had the power to literally influence the physical growth of that plant, or to instantly tame a wild animal.
It describes a state of existence where humanity was not separated from the world by a barrier of abstract thoughts and intellectual analysis. They were deeply embedded in the natural forces.
Completely embedded.
But Steiner argues that cosmic evolution requires constant change. As humanity evolved into what he terms the Aryan root race, and it is strictly necessary to pause here and clarify that in anthroposophical terminology, this refers broadly to the current epoch of civilized thinking humanity and has absolutely no connection to the corrupted, abhorrent political usage of that term in the 20th century.
Thank you for clarifying that context. It's incredibly important.
Absolutely.
As humanity evolved into this modern epoch, that profound magical capacity for image memory had to deteriorate. It purposefully faded away to form the necessary foundation for our current power of logical reason, individual self-awareness, and conceptual thinking.
In simple terms, we traded our magic memory for a calculator. We gave up our deep connection to nature to gain individual intellectual freedom.
That is a highly effective way to synthesize it. And this esoteric narrative provides a brilliant, illuminating contrast to modern academic psychology.
How so?
Consider the concept of unconscious inference developed by the 19th century physicist and psychologist Hermann von Helmholtz. Helmholtz realized that our brains do not passively record the world like a camera. Our brains actively, unconsciously deduce, guess, and constantly reconstruct reality based on highly limited sensory data. We are always running algorithms to guess what is happening around us.
But Steiner is arguing that early man didn't deduce at all. They didn't need unconscious inference or reconstructive schemas because they operated on direct, intuitive spiritual perception and pure, unadulterated memory of the world as it truly was.
Exactly. In modern evolutionary biology, we say that random mutation and natural selection added the massive neocortex to handle complex logic, taking the processing burden off the older, deeper brain structures like the medial temporal lobe.
Right.
In Steiner's methodology, evolution is entirely a spiritual transaction. A spiritual faculty, the magical memory and direct perception, is intentionally sacrificed. It dies, essentially, so that it can be reincarnated in a new physiological form to serve a new purpose, the birth of individual, self-dependent intellectual logic.
I really love this concept, and I want to offer an analogy that grounds it in our modern daily lives. Please do.
Think about how we navigate geography today. 20 years ago, before smartphones, you had to cultivate a deeply accurate spatial memory of your city. You knew instinctively where north was, you remembered landmarks, you knew the physical layout of the streets.
You had to, or you'd get lost.
Right. Now, we rely entirely on GPS navigation. GPS is an external system of pure logic and rigid rules. Because we constantly outsource our navigation to the logic engine of the GPS, our internal spatial memory degrades.
That makes perfect sense.
We sacrifice our innate spatial memory for the immediate convenience of the algorithmic calculator. Steiner is basically saying humanity traded its perfect, magical internal connection to the universe for the ability to invent the logical mind.
It is a profound, if controversial, way to view human cognitive history. In his view, we lost our direct connection to the divine life force, but we gained our independent self-consciousness. We gained the realization of the I.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive, the Akasha Chronicle versus academic theories of memory. We've talked around it, but what exactly is the Akasha Chronicle? In Steiner's spiritual framework, the Akasha Chronicle is an eternal, living script existing within the spiritual world.
A living script.
It is a realm where all past events, every human thought, every emotion, and every physical action do not just leave a dead historical trace, but continue to exist and take place in full, vibrant life. Time does not destroy or decay them.
That sounds incredible.
However, this chronicle is entirely imperceptible to the physical senses of the logical brain. It is accessible only to the clairvoyant eye, to those who have actively developed that lucid spiritual perception we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's zoom all the way out and do a grand synthesis of this massive, towering stack of sources you gave us. We have explored 3 entirely different, massive paradigms of what memory actually is.
Let's lay them out side by side. First, we explored the materialist and academic view.
Right.
In this paradigm, memory is an impermanent, constantly decaying biological enneagram. It is housed strictly within the dark bone of the skull, written in proteins, CRE1 factors, and synaptic terminals.
It's all biological hardware.
Yes. It is highly prone to mechanical failure. It is entirely reconstructed by prejudiced schemas every time we access it, and it's fundamentally tied to the physical health of the brain tissue. When the tissue dies, the memory is obliterated.
Okay, then second, we examine the quantum physics view. Here, memory might actually be a fundamental property of the universe itself.
A completely different scale.
Right. It is mathematically encoded in the wave interference patterns and the fine geometric structure of space-time, accessed via delicate quantum entanglement, acting through the tiny microtubule structures in our neurons. The brain is not a storage hard drive. It is a complex biological transceiver tuning into a cosmic broadcast.
And third, we explored Steiner's spiritual view. In anthroposophy, the perfect, unedited memory of the cosmos is flawlessly preserved in a higher spiritual realm, the Akasha Chronicle.
So memory isn't even physical at all.
Right. Individual human memory is simply a temporary tool, a faculty of the soul that intentionally morphs, decays, and changes across different evolutionary epochs and physical incarnations to serve the ultimate development of human freedom and logic.
Looking at these 3 worldviews, I have to ask a question that might sound crazy. Is it possible that Roger Penrose's quantum geometry of spacetime, David Bohm's holographic interference patterns, and Rudolf Steiner's Akasha Chronicle are all just different vocabularies trying to describe the exact same underlying reality?
It is a phenomenal question, and it really highlights the limits of our distinct academic paradigms. Physics is obsessively looking at how the mathematics, the megahertz frequencies, the space-time grooves, the wave collapses.
The mechanics of it all.
Neuroscience is strictly looking at the hardware, the microtubule stylus, the CA3 recurrent collaterals, the synaptic protein biology. And esoteric philosophy like Steiner's is looking at the who and why, the spiritual operator behind the machine, the evolutionary purpose of consciousness, the journey of the soul navigating these dense physical realms.
So they're all looking at the same thing from different angles.
If we borrow your earlier analogy of the forensic sketch artist, or the classic parable of the blindfolded men touching the elephant, physics is measuring the texture of the elephant's trunk, biology is dissecting the anatomy of the leg, and spirituality is trying to speak to the elephant. They might all be touching different facets of the exact same incomprehensible cosmic structure.
What an unbelievable journey this has been. From Eric Kandel watching sea snails slowly grow new synaptic terminals under a microscope, to Stuart Hameroff calculating the gigahertz frequencies of quantum microtubule vibrations inside a single cell, all the way to Rudolf Steiner describing ancient Atlantean priests harnessing the life force of plants through perfect magical memory. We have covered an immense amount of ground.
Exposing yourself to this breadth of thought fundamentally changes how you view a simple everyday act of remembering.
It really does change everything. So the next time you are frantically running around your house because you forgot where you put your car keys, take a deep breath.
Seriously, cut yourself some slack.
Remember that your brain is attempting to coordinate a 100 trillion synapse network, potentially collapsing millions of delicate quantum superpositions in real time, and reaching out into the fundamental fabric of space-time itself just to find your keychain. It's hard work.
And looking at this entire stack of sources leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to consider.
I'm ready.
If the physicists proposing the memory field and Rudolf Steiner's spiritual cosmology are both essentially right in their core premise, that the true, permanent record of the past exists completely outside the physical brain, whether you call it the quantum geometry of space-time or the spiritual Akasha Chronicle, and the biological brain is merely the noisy, easily distracted tuning dial.
What happens when it breaks?
Exactly. What happens when that physical brain completely shuts down at the end of life? Do our memories simply vanish into the dark abyss of nothingness? Or do we finally drop the faulty biological receiver, step outside the limitations of our meat and bones, and experience the pure, unedited, eternal record of our existence?
Wow. That is something profound to chew on as you go about your week. Thank you so much for providing such an incredible, mind-expanding stack of sources for this deep dive. Keep questioning the nature of your own reality, keep exploring the unknown, and we will see you next time.